Lagos was alive with the usual hustle and bustle of a typical morning. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting a golden glow over the sprawling cityscape, yet the streets were already packed. The familiar sounds of car horns, the chatter of vendors hawking their wares, and the constant hum of busy Lagos traffic filled the air. The day had just started, but Lagos felt like it was already halfway through its routine. For Ada, a young woman born and raised in the heart of Lagos, this was just another day in the life. She had always prided herself on her ability to move through the city with ease. She knew every street, every shortcut, and every bus route. There was a rhythm to Lagos, a kind of unspoken dance, and Ada had perfected it. Whether she was hopping from one bus to another or weaving through crowds in the market, Ada was a Lagos girl through and through. Today, she had a full schedule ahead: meetings, errands, a quick stop at the market, and then back home to prepare for dinner with friends. It was an average Thursday morning, but in a city like Lagos, nothing was ever truly average. Everything could change in an instant. She stepped onto the busy bus, her feet stepping carefully over the uneven pavement, adjusting her shoulder bag to make sure everything was in place. She took a deep breath, relishing the cool morning air that rushed past her face. As usual, the bus was crowded. A dozen people, all lost in their own worlds, stood and sat close together, trying to make space for themselves. It was the typical chaos that came with commuting in Lagos. But for Ada, this was just another part of the routine. She found a seat near the window and sat down, letting out a small sigh of relief. The seat was warm, the air was thick with the smell of cooked food and street vendors, but Ada was used to it. She had grown up in the city. She had learned to ignore the minor discomforts and focus on the task at hand. The bus rumbled down the road, the rhythmic motion of it lulling her into a sense of calm. Outside the window, she watched the city come to life. Pedestrians rushed to their destinations, the market vendors began setting up their stalls, and the constant movement of the traffic created a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm. Lagos was never still. It was always moving, always alive. But this morning, something felt different. As the bus moved along the familiar route, Ada noticed a few unfamiliar faces among the regular crowd of commuters. There was a man sitting 2 rows ahead of her, his face partially obscured by a newspaper. He had the kind of look that seemed slightly out of place. His clothes, though clean, had a sharpness to them that made him stand out. He glanced over his newspaper occasionally, his eyes scanning the people around him, but his gaze always seemed to linger just a bit too long. Ada brushed it off. It was probably nothing. She had seen many strange faces on the bus. Then, there was a woman standing by the door, holding a phone tightly in her hand. She was speaking softly into it, her eyes darting around as though she was watching for something or someone. Ada didn't think much of it at first. People talk on the phone all the time on public transport, especially in a city like Lagos. But the woman's gaze seemed to flicker toward the driver, and for just a split second, Ada felt a sense of unease. Something in the air had shifted. Ada tried to shake off the feeling, shifting in her seat to get more comfortable. Maybe she was just tired. It had been a long week, and she had a million things running through her mind. The bus stopped at a traffic light, and she looked out the window, letting her mind wander. The sun was rising higher now, and the streets were becoming more crowded. She could see a long line of cars ahead of her, all inching forward at a snail's pace. Typical Lagos traffic. She sighed, closing her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the noise and the chaos around her. She longed for peace, for a moment of silence, but it never lasted long in Lagos. Just then, Ada's eyes flicked toward the man who had been sitting with the newspaper. He was no longer reading it. Now, his eyes were scanning the passengers, but this time, his gaze lingered on her. She felt a slight chill run down her spine as their eyes met. She looked away quickly, pretending not to notice. Why was she so paranoid? She told herself to relax. She had been through this a million times. People stared. People observed. That was just part of the hustle of the city. Ada had learned to ignore it all, but her instincts told her to be cautious. There was something about this man that felt off. The bus moved on, jolting as it hit a pothole in the road. Ada was snapped out of her thoughts, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. But her mind couldn't shake the strange feeling. Why had he been staring at her like that? And then, she noticed something even stranger. The woman with the phone had stopped talking. She wasn't looking at her phone anymore. Instead, she was staring at the man with the newspaper, her lips pressed together in a tight line. The exchange was subtle, almost unnoticed by the other passengers, but Ada saw it. It was like a quiet, unspoken communication between the two. Her unease grew, and for the first time, Ada wondered if maybe there was more to this ride than she had initially thought. Maybe this wasn't just another ordinary day in Lagos after all. The bus continued to drive through the streets, but Ada couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. And she had no idea how much this simple ride was about to change her life. The bus rumbled down the street, its engine a steady hum as Ada sat back in her seat, trying to shake off the unease that had taken root in her chest. She tried to push away the feeling that something was wrong. It was just the usual commute. She had been on this bus route 100 times before, hadn't she? She told herself to relax, to focus on her phone, to drown out the noise of the crowded bus. But there was something in the air, a heaviness, a tension, that she couldn't ignore. She had lived in Lagos long enough to know that the city's pulse wasn't always predictable. Danger didn't always announce itself with loud, obvious signs. Sometimes it was quieter, subtle. It crept in through your senses, and if you weren't paying attention, it could swallow you whole. Ada couldn't help but notice how the man in the dark clothing kept moving. At first, he had simply shifted from the front of the bus to the middle, but now he was making his way toward the back, inching closer with each stop. Every time he moved, his eyes flicked toward her, not in a casual way, like someone just scanning the crowd, but in a way that felt too deliberate, too focused. She tried not to look at him, but her gaze kept returning to him, as if her body instinctively recognized the danger that her mind refused to admit. What was he doing? Her fingers hovered over her phone, ready to text her sister, ready to call someone, anyone, just in case. But she didn't. It was probably nothing. She was being paranoid, but the unease lingered, gnawing at her. Then, there was the woman at the door, the one who had been whispering into her phone earlier. Ada had tried to ignore her at first, dismissing her as just another passenger on the crowded bus. But now, the woman wasn't talking. She was staring straight ahead, her face tense, her eyes darting from the driver to the man in dark clothing. Ada could have sworn that for a brief moment, their eyes locked, as if the two were communicating silently, a warning, a signal. Ada's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't imagined it. She had seen it clearly. The woman was alert. She was watching. But watching for what? Ada quickly glanced around the bus. The passengers were still oblivious, lost in their own worlds, staring at their phones, talking quietly among themselves. Everyone seemed unaware of the tension mounting in the air. Had they not noticed? Or had they simply chosen to ignore it? Her eyes snapped back to the woman. The phone was now tucked away in her pocket. Her fingers were clenched tightly around something she was holding, something Ada couldn't see. Her expression was no longer calm. There was something guarded in her eyes, something sharp and calculating. The man in dark clothing was still watching her. Ada's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't right. Was it a coincidence? Maybe. But Ada knew better than to ignore her gut instinct. There were too many strange things happening all at once. Too many signs pointing in the wrong direction. She had to stay alert, trust her instincts. But as the bus continued to make its way through the streets, her anxiety only deepened. She checked the time. She was supposed to get off in just a few more stops. Nothing unusual had happened yet, but she couldn't shake the feeling that danger was close. Her hands were trembling slightly as she clutched her phone, trying to appear calm on the outside. She tried to shake it off again, just focus on something else. Don't give in to the fear. But her mind kept returning to the details she couldn't ignore. The man's repeated movements, the woman's strange silence, the way they both seemed to be waiting for something. It was as if the whole bus had become a stage, with each person playing their part in a story she didn't understand. And Ada was no longer just a passenger, she was part of it. The bus made another turn. This time, it wasn't a familiar one. The usual route had changed. She looked at the windows. The buildings outside were unfamiliar. She saw fewer cars on the road, fewer people walking along the sidewalk. The city was becoming quieter, the streets emptier. Her heart thudded in her chest. Where was the bus going? She leaned forward, trying to catch the driver's eye through the rearview mirror. He was focused on the road ahead, his expression neutral. Was it possible that this was just another detour? A longer route due to traffic? She tried to convince herself that she was overthinking things. But every instinct in her screamed that this wasn't a random change. This was deliberate. Ada's gaze flicked back to the man. He was still staring at her. Something was wrong. The discomfort in her stomach was growing. She shifted in her seat, glancing at the other passengers. No one else seemed to notice. They were still wrapped up in their own worlds, oblivious to the tension building in the air. Was she the only one who saw the signs? Or had they all chosen to ignore them? Maybe they were all just too tired, too used to the unpredictable nature of Lagos. Maybe they had learned to shut out the warning signs because in a city like this, you had to ignore things to keep your sanity. But Ada couldn't. The unease grew until it was a knot in her stomach, pulling tighter with every passing minute. She couldn't shake the feeling that this bus ride was about to turn into something much worse than she could have imagined. Her heart was racing now. Every instinct screamed for her to get off the bus, to find a way to escape. But something deep inside her told her that wasn't an option anymore. The bus had taken another turn, and the streets outside had grown unfamiliar, quieter. The crowds were gone. The city had disappeared, replaced by empty roads and shadows. This wasn't just a detour. Ada's eyes darted to the front of the bus, trying to make eye contact with the driver. He had always seemed like just another faceless figure to her. Nothing special, just another person doing their job. But now, his silence felt more ominous. His steady grip on the wheel was almost too deliberate. He didn't seem to notice the tension in the air. Or maybe he was part of it. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her purse. She couldn't help but notice how the bus had slowed down. The usual hum of the engine had become more pronounced, but in a way that didn't sound right. It was a noise that felt like a warning. The man in dark clothing was still near the back. Now, though, he had stopped moving. His eyes were fixed on her, his stare unwavering, as if he was waiting for something to happen, waiting for her to make a move. She was becoming more aware of every small movement on the bus now. Every flick of an eye, every shift in the air. The whispering woman was silent. She no longer looked at her phone. Instead, her eyes were trained on the man in dark clothing, and when their gazes met, Ada could swear they exchanged a silent understanding. Was this planned? She wanted to stand up, to shout for help, to tell someone on the bus that something wasn't right. But she couldn't. If she spoke up now, it could make everything worse. If she made a scene, what would they do? What if they had already planned everything? What if this was their way of trapping her? What if this wasn't a random ride? Ada tried to steady her breathing, trying to remain calm. Her thoughts were racing, spinning out of control. She couldn't think straight. She had no way of knowing who could be trusted. What if there were others on the bus involved in whatever was happening? Her eyes shifted to the other passengers. They were all acting as though nothing was happening. The elderly woman sitting across from her, the teenagers who had been joking only minutes ago, they were all completely unaware. It made Ada sick to her stomach. How could they not see what was happening? Her mind raced back to the signs, the small things she had noticed earlier, the strange look in the man's eyes, the tense silence from the woman on the phone, the way everyone seemed to be positioning themselves. It was all falling into place, and it wasn't good. A sense of impending doom washed over her. This wasn't a random ride. This was deliberate. Then, as if on cue, the man in the dark clothing stood up, moving toward her. His footsteps were slow and deliberate, his gaze locked on her. No. This was it. Ada's heart skipped a beat. She looked desperately for an exit, but the bus had no open doors. The only exit was at the front, where the driver was, and with the way things were going, she didn't trust that door to be an escape. There were no other cars on the road, no pedestrians to help. The man stopped just in front of her. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a cold calculation. "Excuse me," he said softly, but there was an edge to his voice that made her blood run cold. "We need you to come with us." Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to push him away, but she knew it would be futile. She was too outnumbered, too alone. Her mind raced. What do I do? What's the next move? She glanced at the door again, then at the window. It was a tiny window at the back of the bus, but if she could reach it, if she could break it, could she jump out and run? Would they catch her before she had the chance to escape? "Don't make this harder than it has to be," the man said, his voice calm but firm. Ada could feel the cold sweat forming on her back. She wanted to scream, but all that came out was a weak, trembling exhale. Her mind was spinning in 100 directions. She needed to think. She had to stay calm. "Please, just let me go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her words felt like they were being swallowed by the thick air inside the bus. But the man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he simply stared at her, his face betraying no emotion. The woman who had been watching them both from across the aisle now stood up and moved closer, her face serious, almost detached. She didn't say a word. Ada could feel her chest tightening, her breath shallow and quick. This was happening. She was out of options. She had to act now, before they got any closer. Without thinking, she pushed herself up, nearly knocking the seat in front of her over as she shoved her way to the aisle. The man in the dark clothing reached for her, but she was already moving, her heart pounding as she ran for the back of the bus. She heard him shout something, but her mind was on one thing: escape. She reached the emergency exit at the back, grabbed the lever, and yanked. It didn't open immediately, but with a desperate tug, the door flew open. Before she could stop to think, she jumped. The ground rushed toward her, and she closed her eyes, bracing for impact. Everything seemed to slow down as she fell, and for a split second, Ada wondered if she would survive this. Would she make it? Would she be able to run far enough to escape whatever had just happened on that bus? The moment her feet hit the ground, she sprinted, not looking back. The world around her was a blur of motion, and all she could focus on was the sound of her breath and her pounding heart. She had escaped, but she didn't know for how long. Ada's legs burned as she ran through the darkening streets, her heart racing in her chest like a drumbeat she couldn't silence. The cold night air bit at her skin, but she didn't feel it. She couldn't feel anything but the adrenaline pumping through her veins, driving her forward. The sound of her shoes slapping against the pavement was drowned out by the overwhelming rush of panic inside her. She had jumped off the bus, but she hadn't escaped. Not really. The images flashed through her mind as she ran. The man's cold gaze, the woman's silence, the fear that had settled in her stomach as she realized they weren't just trying to rob her, they were trying to take her. The truth began to sink in and her breath hitched. It hadn't just been a robbery. It had been a trap. They hadn't been after her wallet. They had been after her. Ada's feet slowed, and she stopped near a dark alleyway, her body trembling from exhaustion and fear. She leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath, but her thoughts were spinning. The bus had taken her far from home, and she had no idea where she was or who to trust. It felt like the city she had known her entire life had suddenly become a foreign, dangerous place. She looked around, checking the empty street. It was quiet, too quiet. What now? She needed to get home, but that felt impossible. The streets of Lagos had always been familiar to her, but now they felt threatening. Every corner seemed to hide something she couldn't see, every shadow a potential danger. What if they came after her? Ada's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. She tried to steady herself, but she couldn't stop shaking. No one knew where she was. No one had any idea what had just happened to her. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Should she call the police? Should she text someone for help? But what could she even say? How could she explain what happened without sounding insane? She quickly typed a message to her sister, her fingers moving frantically. "I'm okay. I just need to get home. Don't tell Mom, not yet." She pressed send, then slipped the phone back into her bag. She was getting paranoid now. They weren't after her anymore. They couldn't be. But the feeling in her gut, the one that told her this wasn't over, was impossible to ignore. As she stood in the alleyway, trying to gather her bearings, the reality of the situation became clear. She had narrowly escaped something much worse. The bus had taken a turn that wasn't on the usual route. The driver had stopped listening to her. And those people, those strangers, had been waiting for her to make a mistake. What were they planning? Was this part of something bigger? Was she just a target because she was an easy victim? All of it raced through her mind, and she realized just how close she had come to losing everything. If she had stayed on that bus, if she hadn't trusted her instincts. The thought made her stomach turn. Her phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a news alert. She opened it hesitantly, her hands still shaky from the adrenaline. Lagos police report a string of robberies on the 2:15 bus route. Authorities suspect a planned series of attacks. At least 2 passengers have been reported missing in the past week. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Missing. Her mind raced. Had she been the target all along? The robbery, the silence from the other passengers, the way everything had seemed too coordinated. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't just about money. They hadn't been after her purse, her phone, or even her wallet. They had been after her, and they had planned it. The realization struck her hard. She wasn't just a victim of an isolated incident. This was a well-organized scheme, and she had narrowly slipped through their fingers. The thought of what could have happened, what they could have done to her, made her want to vomit. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it was a message from her sister. "Where are you? Are you okay? Call me. I'm worried." Ada swallowed hard and quickly typed back, "I'm fine. Just a little shaken. I'll be home soon." But even as she typed, the doubt crept in. How could she go back? Could she go back to her normal life after this? Would everything be the same? Or had something inside her been irreparably changed? A loud honking sound broke through the silence, and Ada jumped, her heart skipping a beat. Her head snapped toward the noise, and she realized it was a car pulling up to the curb. A man in a black suit stepped out. His face was familiar. She had seen him earlier on the bus, sitting near the back, quietly watching her. No, this wasn't just a coincidence. He was here. Ada froze. Her heart raced, panic swelling in her chest again. She couldn't go back. Not now. The man's eyes met hers from across the street. His lips curled into a slow, almost predatory smile. She didn't wait to see what he would do next. She ran. As she sprinted down the street, her heart was pounding so loudly she thought it might give out. She had to keep running. She had to escape. She couldn't stop. Not yet. The lessons were clear now. No one could be trusted. She had barely escaped with her life, but the consequences of that one bus ride, of ignoring the warning signs, would haunt her forever. Lagos had always felt like home, but now it felt like a trap.